Hi, you're watching Meet the Professors. I'm your host, Professor Deana Pollard Sacks, and I am the Roberson King Professor of Law at Texas Southern University. My guest today is Fred Galves, and Fred is a professor at the McGeorge School of Law in Sacramento, and he's also written at least 2 textbooks on evidence law as well as a lot of other scholarship. I'm so glad you can come and join me, Fred.
Great, glad to be here.
We're going to be talking today about discrimination, and discrimination is sort of a loaded word, and a lot of people really don't know what it's all about. I mean, there's some forms of discrimination that are blatantly illegal, there's other forms that are completely legal, and then there's the in-between, which we're going to focus on. But first, let's just start with, when people hear discrimination, they think of illegal discrimination that you can be sued for. So what does that consist of?
Yeah, that's like the overt discrimination. The worst case, of course, was things like slavery and segregation. Right. State-based or race-based state laws that discriminate against individuals based on the color of their skin. So those kind of things. And also that could be in the Civil Rights Act too. So there's private discrimination in, say, a private firm, or employment discrimination if you don't hire someone because of their race, things of that nature. You deny someone a loan because of their race, you don't allow them into your restaurant. Oftentimes people think that that's the only form of discrimination. Everyone recognizes that that's racist, but there are a lot of other forms of discrimination that aren't necessarily racist.
Right, and I was born in 1964, and it's the Civil Rights Act of 1964, also known as Title VII. And so, for me and people, younger than me, it's so foreign to us, the concept that you could have a note on the HR office saying, blacks need not apply. We're only hiring management level employees. I mean, the idea that you could be just specifically told you cannot apply because of the color of your skin, and that was all turned around in 1964, where for the first time private employers were told you can't discriminate in hiring. So now I think most people are familiar with that. You can't just deny someone a job or say you can't come into my restaurant because you're a certain color, although there's of course certain jobs where your strength matters, longshoremen or something like that. So there's certain jobs where a small female may be denied. It's not really because of gender, it's because of
But notice that would be merit-based.
Right.
That would not be race-based.
Right.
Of course, you have to make sure that that's not a pretext for really race-based. But anyway, there are some things that are truly merit-based. If you could speak a language, of course, they'll hire you as an interpreter. You got to be able to speak the language.
Right. And then there's a lot of other discrimination that's perfectly legal, and just sort of describe what that's about.
Well, take when you vote for president. Maybe if somebody doesn't vote for Hillary Clinton because she's a woman, or someone votes against Obama because he's African American, we would think of those as being discriminatory, maybe not too nice or thoughtful, but that's completely legal. Who you date, who you marry, who your friends are.
Who do you invite to your summer party?
Yeah, where you go to the movies with, that sort of thing. You can't just file a lawsuit and say, hey, you discriminated against me because not enough Chinese came to your party or
your wedding
like that.
or whatever.
Yeah.
Right, so there's this sort of overt, blatant discrimination that is clearly unlawful. Then there's a lot of other discrimination that's considered a matter of personal choice. And then there's this other enormous growing body of evidence that we all operate with some kind of implicit bias, often without knowing it at all. That's why it's implicit. And that's what we're going to focus on today, is this stereotyping that takes place within our minds, but affects our judgment, our perceptions of people, how we view people, how we treat people, and really affects the quality of our lives by making these snap judgments without realizing it, and often eliciting a response from people who we apply stereotypes to, because even though we may not know we're operating under a stereotype, the target of that stereotype often does feel it. Those famous doll studies of the 1940s, the Clarks did the doll studies where I think for the first time it really became obvious that even children are aware of bias and discrimination. And for those who may not be aware of the doll studies, it was black dolls and white dolls, and they were identical except for the skin color. And they would ask children, in metropolitan areas like New York, to pick which is the good doll and which is the bad doll, or which is the pretty doll and which is the ugly doll. And both black and white children children chose the black doll as the bad doll. And that was even more pronounced in the DC area where there was segregation, where the black children had, clearly lesser schools. This is all before Brown versus Board of Education, of course. But I would have been surprised to see the black children pick the black dolls as the bad dolls.
Well, that shows the power of stereotyping, the power of assumption. And when you think of prejudice, what is that? That's prejudgment. So you're judging people based on group affiliation. And so there's no reason why the victims of the stereotyping should be immune from the stereotyping. And so they can, adapt, or they can really adopt actually those negative feelings that people are feeling toward them. They could look within and internalize them and come to believe the stereotype about themselves.
Well, I've done this research for years. I was in Linda Krieger's class back at Berkeley, in 1999, I guess it was, and started learning about this and actually wrote about it, and fairly recently wrote a chapter in a book called Implicit Racial Bias Across the Law, edited by Justin Levinson at University of Hawaii and Rob Smith. And when we had the conference at Harvard, a clip was shown of this doll study, and this little black girl was picking, the good doll and the bad doll and the pretty doll, and she point to the white doll as a pretty doll and the black doll as the ugly doll. And then they said to her, the last question was, which doll looks like you? And she started to point to the white doll, but then she realized that's not quite right. And she kind of reluctantly moved her finger to the black doll. And I just felt so bad watching that, because you could see in this little girl's face that after identifying the black doll as the bad doll, she didn't want to identify with it. But then in the end she had to, because it matched her skin color. Yeah. And those are such profound studies, because it's showing that even children are aware of the stereotypes.
Martin Luther King used to say about young black children that he could see the clouds of inferiority developing in their little mental sky, even early on.
That's so sad. And you told me about a study recently about actors being interviewed. Yes. Describe that to me.
And this shows you that, it's not just in the 1940s, and then we had the Civil Rights Act, and now we don't have racism. Some people think we have a black president, and so now there's no racism at all.
Right, it proves we're not racist if we have a black president, right?
But it was a fairly recent study, and they had 3 actors play lawyers, and the 3 actors were a white male, white female, and African-American male. And they weren't really lawyers, but they had some partners in firms, and they said, hey, you're going to judge these lawyers in a negotiation, and just, tell us your impressions of them. So they told the 3 actors, it was in 2 stages. The first stage is they said, in the negotiation, your opponent is going to really take the lead, make arguments, be threatening. Do not respond. Just kind of sit back, make a few notes, look at them and listen, maybe nod your head a couple of times, but be very passive and inactive during the negotiation. Well, then that was the first part of it. They asked the partners, who were mostly older white males, to evaluate them. For the female, the young female attorney, they said her inaction showed that she might have been afraid, no fire in the belly, didn't really understand that she has to go in there and fight for her clients.
Incompetent, probably, or something like that, right?
African-American male. There was an intellectual suspicion too. In over his head, doesn't really know what's going on, doesn't know how to act, doesn't know how to fight. But the white male, who did the exact same thing, they said, oh, he's being very strategic. He's just sitting back and taking it all in and watching, waiting for his move. He's letting the other side hang themselves. That's what he's doing. And see, there's just an assumption of competence or an assumption of incompetence. Now, those lawyers who were evaluating them, they don't think that they're racist. They think slavery is horrible and segregation is horrible. But it's this implicit bias that they have, where you're either presumed incompetent until you prove otherwise that you're competent, or, and this is where some of the privilege comes in, you're assumed competent until you do something to prove yourself incompetent. And that's hard to do, to always be working out of a hole.
Well, and the scary thing too is that it's all implicit. I mean, the people who are applying stereotypes don't know they're doing it. And this converges with the research on what's called behavioral confirmation, or the self-fulfilling prophecy. And there was a study from 1974 that I remembered when you were talking about this study. And what they did is they had black candidates and white candidates for a job. And they had interviewers, but but they were watching the interviewers, as much as the interviewees. They were really focused on the interviewers. So these white interviewers were interviewing whites and blacks, and they found that when they were interviewing the black candidates, they gave them less time to answer the questions, they made less eye contact, they treated them with sort of less urgency, is how the researchers said it. They just didn't seem to really focus on what they were saying, and they weren't taking their candidacy seriously, so to speak. And lo and behold, the black candidates didn't respond very well to that. I mean, I wouldn't either, to be treated that way. And then the interviewers, of course, ended up thinking, oh, black male, oh, he's hostile by nature. Well, they elicited that, and to prove that, what they then did is they objectified the two interview styles, the ones, and how the interviewers treated the white candidates versus the black candidates. Then they interviewed all white candidates, but they applied the two interview styles, and lo and behold, the white candidates who were given the black interview style also got angry and frustrated, like anyone would. And so the thing that's so scary is that the interviewers thought that the black candidates were just becoming angry because that's how they are, and they didn't even realize that they were eliciting anger by their really disrespectful treatment of the black candidates. And again, they didn't even know they were doing it.
And all the while thinking they're fair, and all the while thinking it's based on truth. Let me go back to that, the second part, though, of the 3-actor study, because after they said don't do anything in the negotiation, then they went to the actors and they said, now we want you to get really active, be very accusatory of your opponent, and finally stand up and pound on the table, we're going to court. Well, now you can imagine the reaction. For the white female, instead of being afraid and incompetent and all of that, she went from 0 to the B word of, just being very ball-busting, hardcore, hysterical, that sort of thing.
Another stereotype about women, they're hysterical. If they show any emotion at all, oh, she's hysterical, irrational. Whereas if a man shows emotion, it's like, well, what did you do to cause him, to do that?
Yeah, what did you do to cause him to react that way? Because it's obviously legitimate. Then with the African-American male, it's like, oh, he went ghetto on them because he got so angry and he threw his fist down, and doesn't he realize you can't intimidate people that way? The white male, of course, now they said very committed to his position, very strong, will be a good fighter for the cause, justified moral outrage, and that sort of thing. And again, to show how it's all about your assumptions and how you look at things. When we say, we look at life through rose-colored glasses, it's kind of the same thing, only those can be colored in the sense of race or gender or any other kind of stereotype.
And the reality is white men, especially tall, nice-looking white men, have almost no obstacles. I mean, they might have some, but not compared to the rest of us. Being female, being non-white, all the things that sort of cause people to stereotype and assume that you're not competent or not as good as a white male candidate. And I saw a research study once that said that if you're a white male in America over 5'11", I think it was, or 6 foot, you are statistically very likely to make 6 figures. So just being a tall white man right there, people want you as their front man, they want you as their product sales representative, because it's not so much necessarily the employer is being discriminatory, but the employer knows that those tall white men candidates or employees are the ones who are going to make the most sales.
Well, now they face barriers too. There's legitimate barriers that we all face. Hard work, sacrifice, doing your homework, putting your time in. And every white male will tell you that they had to suffer and struggle, and they do. That's part of it. But those are legitimate barriers that we all have to overcome. When you start throwing in illegitimate barriers that one group doesn't have to overcome and another group does have to overcome, you can't point to the fact that there are additional barriers that are unfair to say, oh, well, you're acting like I have no barriers. Clearly there are barriers, but you have to make a distinction. And this implicit bias is an illegitimate barrier.
Absolutely. And the thing is, we're law professors, and you would think that in the legal academy, filled with law professors, people who have at least 2 degrees, often 3 or 4 degrees, sometimes more, that they would not operate under implicit bias because we're so educated. But you told me a story about bringing your baby to work, and relay that story.
Yeah, this was years ago. I was bringing my oldest son now, he's 19, but when he was about 2 years old, I brought him into work. I had the car seat with him in there, and I was doing my work. I had some office hours, so I left the door open. And I can't tell you how many people would walk by And I would hear audibly like, oh, isn't that wonderful? What a good dad.
Right.
What a good dad he is. Look at him. He loves his son so much. He's working here hard,
Right.
but he wants to be with him. And it's just, I could have won Dad of the Year. All right. I told a female colleague about this, who also was at the time younger, and she had brought her child into work, same exact situation,
Right.
only she had a very different experience. People then begin to judge her and say, what a selfish mom. Does she want to be a professor or does she want to be a mom? And one that I just thought was amazing, why is she bringing her child to work? Doesn't she know exposing the child to all these people and exposing them to the germs could make that child sick? How selfish of her. And I thought, for me, it is so easy. Now, being male, the assumption is a good one. I'm great
You're
if I'm
a good
doing
parent
that.
for bringing your kid to work, but the woman, oh, how dare she? Doesn't she understand? So completely different reactions to the exact same behavior, bringing your child to the workplace.
And underscoring how a male can have it all in terms of
Right.
being a dad and
Right.
a career person. But a woman is put to this Hobbesian choice. You got to choose one
Right.
or the other and declare your major.
See,
woman.
and I got that in Houston. I never got that in LA because I practiced law in LA for years. But when I got to Houston, I had, a couple of the moms from the elementary school say to me, well, I had a job and I quit my job when I had my kid, and you shouldn't be working because good mothers quit their jobs and take care of their kids. And mind you, I was a single mom. I had to work. I wanted to take care of my son. I had a great career going, and this was sort of like a legitimate thing to say to me. I mean, they didn't even think twice about telling me to quit my job when I needed my job to work, purely because I'm a female and I had a little boy.
It's so ironic too, because you'd think they would understand the plight of a single mom. They didn't want to recognize your single motherhood. They only wanted to recognize your work as a professor, which, by the way, I mean, you've done things that are all about children's health and children's concern. You write about that, and you've helped individuals, written on Supreme Court briefs trying to help people get custody. So you're in there fighting for women. And to have
children.
your own,
Children,
think that, they're really, you're going to say I'm a bad mom when I'm trying to fight for all women and womanhood and motherhood?
And mind you, the women who did this to me were not exactly real homemakers. I mean, these were women who, to be blunt, were, in the plastic surgeon's office, having Botox parties, drunk in the middle of the day, come to the meetings at the elementary school with alcohol in their breath. And they have the nerve to say anything about me. Now, my mom was a real homemaker. My mom was the CEO of our household. She did everything, the house maintenance, scheduling all the repairmen, taking care of the kids. She was my bluebird leader. I mean, that's a very respectable occupation. Staying at home and caring for kids is a very serious job, and one that is not always recognized, because it's not kind of a thankless job. But the thing is, it's never women like that who've gone after me. It's women like my mom are busy taking care of their children. And one of the reasons why I became a professor was because I had a child, and I said, I need to do something a little different, where I'll have the summers off and the weekends off, because you know how litigators are. You work around the clock. If you get into trial, it's very difficult to raise a child on your own as a litigator.
Yeah. Well, can you imagine if we switched the stereotype around a little bit? You were talking about these women who are not the ones like your mother or the true housewife CEOs that make that decision, but the ones that are really not doing that kind of work. What if we switch that to the father, the stay-at-home dad, and he's not really out there working, being the CEO, but he's on the couch drinking a beer with the remote
during lunch, right?
Yes, and then he has the nerve to call down a career man, and it even sounds funny to say career man, because, but you say career woman, she's making a choice. But if he would say, you're not home taking care of the kids, and then flipping the remote and drinking a beer, because it's that kind of thing that
no one
seems
would
so
do
hypocritical.
That. It's ludicrous, and goes to show how deep the stereotypes are, where it's sort of okay to make certain derogatory comments toward women purely because they're women, despite the fact that they might have been a straight A law student, worked like a dog, and got a job where they could take care of their child well. And this is why I'm so interested in this implicit association test. It's one of the things I learned about when at Berkeley, and it's online, and anyone can get on and take the test, and it has all sorts of areas of implicit bias you can test yourself for. And when I took the test originally, I took a number of categories, and I only showed a significant amount of bias in one category, which really bothered me, because it was gender stereotyping, and I could not comprehend how I could have a gender stereotype, basically seeing women as homebodies and seeing men with briefcases and seeing women with baby bottles and seeing men with offices. And then I thought a lot about it and thought, well, why, as a a law student, I mean, I had been out of law school for 10 years, but I was getting a graduate law degree at Berkeley, but I've been practicing law for 10 years with a lot of very smart Harvard law grads like yourself and people who were incredible career women. Why would I have an implicit association between women in the home and men in the workplace? And then I realized that I was the first woman in my family to get a graduate degree at all, not to mention a graduate law degree. I was the first woman in my family to buy a house on my own. My mom was a homemaker. My aunts, everyone was. Now my sister is also was a teacher. My sister is highly educated, but she's about my same age. And so when I was growing up, I wasn't looking at her to define my expectations of women. She was 17 months older than me, and so I didn't really see her. I mean, we were just both kids, So I saw that, and I remember reading Patricia Devine's work and saying to myself, I don't want to have this stereotype, so what do I do? And I spoke to one of the researchers at some point, and they said, well, what you need to do is if you're hiring, for example, and if a woman comes through your door, you need to stop and take some time and give that female extra consideration to basically counter whatever implicit bias you might be operating under. And I remember when I was looking to hire a director of photography for this show, and I had all these big tall guys coming through. At the end of the day, I opened the door and there's this adorable little lady standing there, and I'm thinking, who is this cute little girl, and she can't be a candidate. Sure enough, she was, and I got to know her a little bit, and I hired her. I mean, she's absolutely fabulous. But when I opened the door and saw her, I thought, this cute little lady, it didn't look like a cinematographer to me. That is, at least the good thing is, I knew that, and I stopped and thought about it, and talked to her, and realized she was, to me, hands down, the best candidate.
What's so good about that is that, it's easy for us on a talk show, you being female and me being Latino, to start talking about racism and sexism like it's a white male problem, but it's really also our problem in the way we think about ourselves, other groups, and white males. We make stereotypical assumptions about them as well. And so it's good to always be looking in the mirror, trying to figure out your own implicit bias.
Because we all operate under them. I mean, almost all of us. And you really can't talk about implicit racial bias unless you focus a little bit on black men, because the research is pretty clear that black men get the brunt of implicit racial bias in our society. I mean, study after study over many years shows that most people hold really negative implicit biases against black men, which accounts, at least in part, if not to a large part, for why black males are overrepresented in our prisons. They're prosecuted more frequently, given harsher sentences. And it's such a terrible plight, I think, to be a black man in our society. And again, people think because President Obama won the election, there must not be too much bias anymore, but that is just blatantly untrue. And in fact, a book came out fairly recently called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And what she does is, and it's somewhat controversial, but I think she makes a compelling case that black men are systematically held down through our court and prison system. We have so many black men incarcerated today, and it does seem to me that there's an awful lot of implicit bias and even overt racism directed at black males. I had this black male student a couple years ago. This is an extraordinarily good-looking young black man, and his father was a lawyer in town, and he was driving his dad's big black Mercedes with a couple of his black friends in the back. Well, he got pulled over, and the police officer, and this was reported to me, so this is secondhand, but I believe him, the police officer produced a little bag of marijuana and claimed that it was his. And he said, that's not mine. He said, well, I found it in your trunk or whatever it was. And he asked for the license of my student, and he saw his name. And he said, is your father so-and-so? And he said, yes, he is. And he put it together. Okay, his dad is a big lawyer in town. This kid is going to be able to fight back. And so he gave tickets to both his friends in the back seat for possession of marijuana. I mean, that is such a common story. And I think a lot of whites don't get that. This is happening. It's happening all the time. And I wish that people would really wake up to the fact that it is not just playing the race card. It is a very serious constant problem that black men and Hispanic men go through. Another one of our colleagues, a professor of law, told me when he was 17, living somewhere in the suburbs of Los Angeles, he was pulled over, and the police officer said to him, "I smell marijuana coming from your car." And this young, again, very nice looking Hispanic young man didn't even know what marijuana was. He was very naive. He had never smoked it, never tried it. And sure enough, the cop did not find marijuana in his car. But the cop probably also didn't smell marijuana in his car. I mean, the police officers seemed to make a story up to justify searching this young Hispanic man's car because he sort of assumed that he's probably a pothead, because after all, he's a young Hispanic man. And thank goodness for this guy, there was nothing in his car, and the police officer did not plant something in his car. But this does happen. It's one of the things I hope people will realize when they watch this show, is this is not, you know, some black person's story about how hard it is to be black in America. It is a very serious problem, and those of us who aren't black, and particularly aren't black men, don't always get that.
Yeah, it's important too that, you know, we're not saying every cop is racist or every white person is racist.
Right.
And so that's a natural defense. When people might hear something like this, they might say, oh, well, you're playing the race card, or you're making it seem like that's always the case. That's not true. And most people who engage in this kind of implicit bias or racism, they don't even realize that they're doing it. That they think they're doing good police work. Right. Or they think, hey, what was it? It was based on a hunch. Where a hunch is like legitimate police work, but that hunch might be racial profiling. And then they justify it by saying, well, even if it's based on race, it's not racist. I just noticed the difference. And
well, hunches are quintessentially subjective.
Yes.
And that's exactly the kind of decision making that produces implicit biased decisions. I mean, more than anything else. Oh, I just don't like that candidate. Why? I don't know. I just have a gut feeling about her. Oh, really? And they can't describe any objective facts as to what she did or what he did. All they can say is, I just don't like him or her. And to me, that is illegitimate, and especially in a law faculty, that should never be considered. Someone's gut reaction, he rubs me the wrong way, or, you know, she seems, I remember one guy, an Asian guy, an incredible scholar, has 3 doctorates, and he's a very down-to-earth, extremely, it's a wonderful man. He's a friend of mine now. And after giving a presentation where he was very polite, I was there. They went to the faculty room, and although I wasn't there, I was told that people started calling him a prima donna, and oh, he thinks he's better than us, just because he's Asian and has 3 degrees. I mean, what else could it be? Because I watched the presentation myself. He was extremely friendly. He wasn't at all condescending toward anybody. That's not who he is. And yet he had to deal with those stereotypes, and I believe they voted him down. I mean, the lack of due process is frightening, and the idea that people were intimidated by him because he is Asian and has 3 doctorates, and then they didn't hire him because he's basically overqualified, but they couldn't say that, and they couldn't say, well, we're intimidated by him, he's more educated than we are, so they had to sort of cut him down and call him a prima donna to justify, you know, and that's a gut, saying he's a prima donna. He didn't say he's a prima donna. I mean, what did he do? And I can tell you, he didn't do anything. So that's the kind of stuff that really bothers me.
Are people's visceral reactions, and then they search for justificatory reasons, and they're smart enough to say, or they're smart enough not to be overtly racist.
Law professors are. Yeah. I mean, that's the problem in our field, is that these people often operate with jealousies or with racist attitudes, but they are smart enough, because they are law professors, to try to find something legitimate. And so they won't say, well, you know, I just don't like her because her scholarship record's better than mine, and I don't want to have the competition or comparison. Instead, they'll say, ooh, I heard she was unfriendly in the workplace, or, you know, I heard she's a real B word, or something like that. And then all of a sudden, you know, people are like sheep. They follow along and say, well, I mean, if that's the rumor about her, I guess we should go with it. I mean, I've never seen a lack of due process in any employment setting the way I've seen it in the legal academy.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, too, that I've seen this when we're thinking about giving tenure or evaluating individuals. Say there's a professor and they get student evaluations. The way those student evaluations are used by professors are really result oriented, because sometimes they'll say, all right, if this professor is well liked, It's just, and they don't like the professor. It's just, well, he's doing a popularity contest, or it's she's too easy.
Hanging out with students,
Right.
too friendly with students, or
Right.
something like that.
That sort of thing. But if they like the professor and they get good evaluations, then they'll say, oh, well, clearly
They're
this
valid.
person is doing a
Right.
good job.
Yeah.
If they don't like the professor and they get bad evaluations, then of course they'll say, well, that the student, obviously they know that this person is not good. We value the student's position. But if they like them, then they'll say, well, what do these students know about whether this person knows the law or not? They're in the least position to be judging that.
Right.
And so in a way, they use those evaluations in whichever way they want to
Kind of
justify
like the
a
Supreme
certain
Court
result.
using whatever
Yeah.
evidence it has, credible or not, to justify its ends. And another area that's just starting to grow is this thing called physical appearance discrimination. And I read about this and I was kind of curious about it. And so I got online, was just doing some research about it. Basically, it comes down to probably jealousy. Like apparently there's a strong bias against attractive people that they are conceited. And so I got online just doing some research and I found a story about Megan Fox. And I saw Megan Fox in a kind of silly, horror film called Jennifer's Body, and I just liked her. I thought she was very talented. It scared the heck out of me, I can tell you that much. It was very late at night in Tallahassee when I was watching it. But she was saying basically that she had to deal with a lot of jealousy from women. And I then looked at the comments made under the story, and I mean, people were calling her every name under the sun. You name it, they called her that. And we're saying things basically like, you're an effing B, and that's why women don't like you. It has nothing to do with you being pretty. And I thought to myself, all you've done is proven her case, because I wrote in myself. I said, I don't think any of you people have ever met Megan Fox. I'm almost sure that the people writing these things about her are just responding to the fact that she had the nerve to say that she has to deal with a lot purely out of female jealousy. And then there was that story about the two young ladies on a flight, and the title, I found this also researching, the title of the news story was Too Pretty to Fly, ? Like, are they too pretty to fly? And what happened was, apparently the flight attendants wouldn't serve them. And these were two, pretty striking young ladies. And they had the nerve to say, well, you're not serving us because we're pretty, and you're just jealous, or whatever they said. Well, the airline kicked them off the flight. And not just that flight, the airline kicked them off for life. Yeah. They can never fly the airline again. And because what they had the nerve to say was they were being mistreated because they were attractive was so horrible that they don't ever want them on a flight again, even though they weren't accused of any crime. They weren't accused of any foul language. They weren't accused of breaking any FAA regulation. They weren't accused of anything except having the nerve to say what they thought about why they were mistreated.
Well, the problem is, if anyone makes that argument, it's such a hard argument to make, and then it seems so conceited if you're making that argument. It's like that old commercial, don't hate me because I'm beautiful. But when I used to think about or hearing about physical appearance, I thought it would be for people who are overweight or have a negative, and I think that is definitely true too.
Absolutely.
But on the physical appearance where it's more of an attractive person, I think the reason that people don't feel sorry for that is they'll just say, hey, you have it so bad. You have a good physical appearance, and we're not going to feel sorry for you.
But the level of hostility, and same with like Angelina Jolie. Like, I'm just a huge fan. I think she's enormously talented, beautiful, smart person. I just love her. And people say, you like Angelina Jolie, as if I'm expected to hate her. And they are surprised to hear me say that, because as a female, I'm kind of supposed to hate her. And also with Megan Fox, I'm kind of a Megan Fox fan. And again, I can't believe you like Megan Fox. I'm like, she's talented. Yeah, I like her. So it just seems like there's this incredible hostility, especially when they become famous and wealthy, like these two ladies have, these two actresses. So I think that there really needs to be a shift in thought, not just about racial bias against overweight bias, which is really serious, by the way. I mean, overweight people report that people will not look them in the eye. They will just
or make assumptions like they're not disciplined.
So obesity has to do with a lot of chemistry in the body, but it is not the result of laziness. I mean, it could be, but it isn't always, and it often is not. So it's too bad that people won't just realize, how unfair it is to judge people on what they look like on the outside and start judging people, as Martin Luther King would say, by the content of their character. And I hope that maybe people will watch the show and maybe take a few of the implicit association tests and just do a little introspection to find out what people out there you might be reacting to negatively without knowing it, and taking some conscious effort to not do that in the future.
Yeah, and make a distinction that don't just look at the very bottom line, is it illegal to discriminate in that sense, because of course, but there are higher standards of what is ethical,
the law is the
what
floor
is moral.
of what's expected of us.
Right.
We should all be doing more than what the law says, because morality demands a lot more than the law does.
Right.
So,
Good.
well, we're about out of time. So thank you very much for tuning in and listening to us. This is Meet the Professors. I'm Professor Deana Pollard Sacks, and we'll hope you tune in next time.